hands of this watch. Yeah, I'll say, Tyler picked these for me today. Hey guys, it's Cam with Craft and Tailored, and this episode of What Is On My Wrist, we are talking about a 1960s Movado Super Sub-Sea Chronograph. It's an M95 movement. The reference is 95-704-541, and this one is an exemplary example. How's that, Pete? You know, as far back as the 1930s, Movado was trading in water-resistant wristwatches, and by the early 1960s, they were producing dive watches built up to stand to the era's most greater-known offerings from companies like Rolex and Omega, and Heuer, Tudor, you know, all kinds of companies. So this essentially is a diving chronograph. I don't know if I would necessarily go diving with this watch, even back in that era, but essentially the Super Sub-Sea brand is kind of their sports lineup of watches using their M95 caliber Movado movements. The Super Sub-Sea is quite possibly the most desirable of all of Movado's dive watches during this era, and this particular reference, 95-704-541, that is a mouthful, is an absolute rarity. This specific example is probably the nicest one that I've ever seen. So that's why I wanted to feature it on the channel, talk a little bit about it. I think Movado in this era is also really cool. You don't see these guys a lot, and when you do see them, they are definitely not in this condition. So this is one of the earliest variations of the chronograph to contain Movado's M95 movement that was first developed actually by Piaget. Not a lot of people know that, but it just actually happens to also be the first modular chronograph movement ever produced as well. So like most of the watch manufacturers back in this era, there was a lot of cooperation between competing companies. In this case, it was Movado and Piaget, kind of like Heuer and Hamilton and Von Buren back in that era as well. Zenith and Rolex, you know, in the later era, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at this kind of at a glance, you might think that this is a Zenith A277. And in fact, it almost is a Zenith A277. Matter of fact, Movado and Zenith back in the 60s were working quite closely together under the same parent company. And so accompanying models of basically the same watch with the brand's kind of twist on the designs were ultimately released. But Zenith is definitely a much more popular brand. It was kind of the leading company at the time. Movado was the sub company in my opinion. So what makes this special is you don't see as many of these as you do the Zenith A277s, making this an absolute rarity. So let's talk a little bit about this specific example. Let's talk a little bit about what I like. And I want to kind of do a little bit of a condition report on this as well. The watch is 40 millimeters in diameter, but the lug width is actually 22, which is kind of interesting. A lot of strap for a watch that is only 40 millimeters in diameter. Really interesting case design. It definitely kind of has that Zenith-esque A277 kind of case. Obviously Movado signed crown, you've got the really cool mid-60s Movado logo, but what makes this watch really interesting is you have this canoe paddle type of hour hand, which is kind of like a broad arrow hand, but interesting. It almost kind of reminds me of the hands that you would see in like the Longines super compressor divers out of this era. The other thing that's really unique is the running seconds hand is kind of like a straight stick hand or baton hand, whatever you want to call it. And then the minutes and the hours elapsed hands are like these snake hands. So they're like these really interesting squiggly kind of snake hands. The case condition of this is insane. It is the nicest Super Sub-Sea chronograph case that I've ever seen. You can see the original case chamfers. It's really thick. I don't believe that this case has ever been polished based on what we're seeing here. The bezel still has like a sharp feel to it. It rotates properly. And the bezel is actually still really deep and dark black. Early tritium luminous material that has taken on this really nice warm golden brown coloration, kind of like a sandy kind of coloration, really eye-catching. And then the dial's also high gloss and gilt, which is also really cool because you don't really see that in sports chronographs from the era. You typically will see stuff that is matte and not gilt. So kind of an uplifted look. The subdials have also kind of taken on this like warm kind of like goldeny silvery kind of hue, if that makes sense, but really spectacular example overall. So really amazing watch. So wanting to keep this one kind of, you know, short and sweet, really awesome and rare watch. These are, again, getting very hard to find. Believe it or not, this watch is valued at $17,850. Definitely not a cheap Movado, but definitely one that is very, very rare and one that we don't see a lot, especially in this condition, which is why I wanted to show it to you. So definitely been getting some time on the wrist. I really like wearing this watch, and it's really cool, don't you think? So in any case, guys, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to, of course, like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications for when we post new content. If you're not doing so already, follow us on Instagram at Craft and Tailored, as well as on TikTok at Craft and Tailored. And if you've got watch questions, we're here and happy to help. Drop us a line, info@craftandtailored.com. Thanks again, guys, for tuning in. I will see you in the next one. Or, you know, sorry, what did I miss?